It's kind of wild to think about, but those famous ink blots, the Rorschach test, they were actually used, like seriously used,
Yeah.
to try and figure out if a man was homosexual.
Yeah, it's pretty startling, isn't it? We're talking, what, 1920s up to nearly 1970?
Exactly. From 1921 right through to 1969. Makes you look at those old psych tests a bit differently.
It really does, especially when you think about how, well, ambiguous those ink blots are supposed to be.
Right. Completely open to interpretation.
And yet they were seen as this scientific tool for detecting sexual orientation. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Totally. And the historical research you've pulled together on this is just fascinating. So for this deep dive, we're going to unpack that whole story.
Yep.
We'll look at how Rorschach was actually used this way, what the researchers, thought they were seeing.
Right, in those blots.
Yeah, and how this whole episode connects to bigger things, psychology, how we even decide what counts as knowledge, social change.
It really tracks the evolution of how we understand identity and the sometimes rocky relationship between science and society.
Definitely. And it's not just some weird historical blip, is it?
No, not at all. Looking at how the Rorschach got used, or maybe misused, like this, it tells us a lot about how science, culture, and pathologizing certain groups can get tangled up.
Yeah,
It really makes you question the assumptions behind research, even now.
absolutely. Our main guide here is a paper by Peter Hegarty. It's called Homosexual Signs and Heterosexual Silences, Rorschach Research on Male Homosexuality from 1921 to 1969.
Published in the Journal of the History of Sexuality, a really thorough piece.
It is. So our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is to get how the Rorschach was used to study male homosexuality, the theories driving it, and what eventually made people question this whole approach.
And ultimately see how science is always sort of embedded in its cultural moment. Right?
Exactly. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The Rorschach wasn't created to hunt for homosexual signs, obviously.
No, it started with Hermann Rorschach, a Swiss psychiatrist. He published his book, Psychodiagnostic, back in 1921.
His big work,
Yeah.
right. Sadly, his only one.
Yeah, he died pretty young soon after.
No.
But the book laid out this inkblot test he'd developed. The idea was to understand personality structure.
And the basic setup, most people kind of know this, 10 symmetrical ink blots.
7 black and white or gray, 3 with color.
And the theory was projection, right?
Yeah.
What you see in the ambiguity supposedly reflects your inner psychological world.
Exactly. But Rorschach himself, he wasn't just interested in what people saw. He was really focused on how they saw it. He developed these categories, determinants, he called them.
Determinants.
Like
Okay.
whether someone focused on color or saw movement or looked at the whole blot versus just a piece, or even used the white space around the ink.
Yeah.
He thought these revealed someone's basic way of, experiencing the world, not just the content.
Interesting. Though some determinants did link to content later, didn't they, incorrectly?
They did, yeah. Things like color or movement got tied, wrongly, to supposed homosexual traits down the line. And some of his original determinants did refer to specifics, too.
Like seeing people or animals.
Right, or what he called original responses,
Those-
things very few people saw.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a tension in his work between clinical use and social research.
Yes, exactly. Hegarty points this out. Rorschach had different ideas about how to administer the test depending on the purpose.
How so?
Well, for clinical diagnosis, he stressed a really precise, almost ritualistic procedure. Very careful.
But for social research.
Much looser. He even suggested it was simple enough to give through an interpreter to someone he termed, using the language of the time, a primitive Negro, just as easily as to a cultured European.
Wow. Okay, so that difference in approach, that kind of opened the door later.
It sort of laid the groundwork, yeah, for applying it broadly, maybe less carefully, to whole groups like homosexual men later on, and
Right.
reflecting the, problematic views of that era.
Right. And there was also this uncertainty about interpretation. Clinical skill versus statistics.
Exactly. Rorschach saw value in the examiner's experience, their clinical intuition, but he also thought statistics could help keep things objective, reduce bias.
But he worried about losing something.
Yeah, losing the richness of clinical insight if you relied only on numbers. It's a debate that honestly still goes on in Rorschach circles.
And get this part, he thought the test could psychologize the psychologists.
Yeah, he did. He talked about kinesthetic interpretations, seeing movement,
Yeah.
and he noted that if the examiner themselves tended to see a lot of movement or very little, it could skew how they interpreted the subject's responses.
So, like, built-in self-awareness check. He was saying the tester needed to know their own biases.
Pretty much. Objectivity wasn't just the test. It was also the tester being aware of their own perceptual habits.
Fascinating. Okay, so Rorschach sets this up in the 20s, but it didn't immediately become huge, did it?
No, it took a while. Things picked up more in the U.S. around the mid-1930s. Researchers started forming networks.
And just like Rorschach, they had different ideas about how to use it.
Definitely. You had folks like Marguerite Hertz. She was very quantitative.
Really?
Lots of data, statistical analysis, trying to link specific response types to psychological traits. Her work really paved the way for later statistical attempts to pin down characteristics, including homosexuality.
Okay, the numbers approach, and the other side.
That was more Bruno Klopfer. He was qualitative, more focused on the individual's unique experience, phenomenological, Haggerty calls it, holistic.
Like understanding the whole picture for that person.
Exactly.
And Klopfer became a really big deal in the U.S. Rorschach
Oh,
world.
absolutely. He'd emigrated from Germany via Switzerland and really pushed the test in America. He started the journal Rorschach Research Exchange in '36.
The main journal for it.
Yeah, for years. And he ran private seminars, teaching his methods. He built this whole network of clinicians and researchers interested in symbolic thought, both in patients and cross-culturally.
So his interpretations carried a lot of weight.
Immense weight. These two approaches, Hertz's numbers and Klopfer's interpretation, they really framed the later arguments about how you'd identify anything with a Rorschach, including homosexuality.
Okay, so now we jump ahead. World War II. Big shift.
Huge shift. The military suddenly needs mass psychological screening, millions of recruits.
And the Rorschach seems like a potential tool.
Especially the group Rorschach. Instead of one-on-one, they'd show the blots to groups, people wrote down answers, more efficient for a large number.
Right. And at the same time, the military starts excluding people based on homosexuality.
Yeah, that became official grounds for psychiatric exclusion during the war. And psychoanalysis had these competing views.
Was it neurosis or psychosis, temporary or permanent?
Right. But either way, it was framed as a problem. And servicemen were told to talk to psychiatrists about any homosexual feelings.
But the psychiatrists then had to report them.
If they thought the person was a sexual psychopath, yes. It put psychiatrists in this really tough spot, therapist or informant.
Wow, so you might have some trying to protect guys, maybe misdiagnosing.
Potentially. But others were focused on identifying and screening out anyone deemed unfit, even trying to sort genuine homosexuals from guys maybe faking it to get out.
Palingerers, they call them.
Exactly, and that's where the Rorschach comes roaring back in.
As a tool to make that distinction.
At least 3 research teams tried to use it that way during the war. One explicitly said they needed a test to tell the genuine chronic homosexuals from the simulators.
So the military context really forced this binary, didn't it? Fit or unfit, straight or gay.
Absolutely. And the Rorschach testing in that setting helped build this idea, this category of the Rorschach homosexual. It's what some call the incorporation of perversion.
Defining it through the test itself.
Exactly. The social context directly shaped how the test was used and read. They really believed the Rorschach could show a specific pattern in genuine cases.
Did it work?
Well, one study in a military prison found no Rorschach signs that distinguished sexual psychopaths. But 2 other groups were more optimistic.
Especially looking at the content of the responses, the symbolic stuff.
Yes. Robert Lindner was a big proponent of looking at content.
Okay, this sounds like where it gets really subjective. What kind of symbols?
Well, Bergman, for example, saw a response like huge repulsive breasts covered with the most exquisite delicate brown silk as proof of genuine homosexuality.
Wow.
He interpreted it as showing unconscious disgust towards women.
Wow, okay. Others?
Lindner linked mysterious notions of electrical influence to paranoia in gay men, and seeing things like a projectile or a ship cleaving through water.
What was it that?
That was interpreted as latent homosexuality, supposedly relating to a fear of and wish for penetration.
That is quite a leap. A projectile equals fear of penetration automatically.
It seems that way. They often use psychoanalytic theory to back this up, comparing Rorschach responses to dreams, like Lindner did, echoing Freud.
So the theory came first, then they found things in the blots to fit in.
It certainly looks like that sometimes. Dew and Wright saw mentions of things like cooking or cleaning feminized behaviors as signs of feminine identifications and weak masculinity. They even described homosexuals as essentially paranoid because of social disapproval without really acknowledging how their own work might be contributing to that pathologizing.
Right, they're blaming the victim almost, pathologizing the anxiety caused by prejudice.
Exactly. So they claimed this expert knowledge, but their interpretations often revealed, well, maybe more about their own assumptions and lack of understanding.
A real disconnect. Claiming knowledge, but also hinting it's all very mysterious and curious.
Right. Okay, so the war ends. But the Rorschach research ramps up, doesn't it?
Big time. By the late 50s, it's like the diagnostic tool in clinical psychology.
Yeah, most widely used.
And it wasn't just about servicemen anymore. They started using it on other groups seen as outside the norm.
Like female sex workers, even Nazi prisoners at Nuremberg. Hegarty calls them enemies of the wartime body politic. The Rorschach became the go-to for understanding anyone deemed other.
And then comes William Marshall Wheeler's dissertation in 1949. This really cements the Rorschach homosexuality link.
It does. People started talking about the Wheeler signs.
So what did Wheeler do differently?
He tried to be more systematic. He surveyed therapists at a VA clinic, asked them to categorize their male patients' sexual tendencies on a scale.
From no homosexual tendencies to overt homosexuality.
Right. And also asked about things like assumed sex roles, perceived masculinity, or femininity.
Sounds like the survey itself was already loaded with psychoanalytic ideas.
Very likely, yeah. It probably reinforced the theories it was meant to test. Then Wheeler compared these therapist ratings to the patient's Rorschach responses.
And came up with this list.
Yep. 20 Rorschach indices of homosexuality, drawing on his own work and suggestions from big names like Myers and Klopfer.
Okay. Did he think the wartime studies were flawed?
He acknowledged limitations, yeah, but he was still optimistic about using content analysis.
And like the wartime guys, he used rigid categories.
Pretty much. He lumped together anyone labeled overt, suppressed, or repressed homosexual into one big homosexual group.
Even if they hadn't actually had same-sex experiences? If they were just repressed?
Likely, yes. So he's comparing this mixed bag homosexual group against a non-homosexual group, looking for differences in their Rorschach signs.
So what kind of signs were on his list? What characteristics?
Things like paranoia again, negative views of women, feminine identification, anal interests, this term, and an interest in physical relationships between, like, beings.
Okay. And how many signs did you need?
Well, he found most men showed at least one sign, so he just kind of arbitrarily decided that 3 or more indicated homosexuality.
3. That seems plucked out of thin air.
It does, but here's what was really new in Wheeler's work. He used statistics, correlation coefficients, to analyze the therapist's diagnostic skills.
How?
He checked how well their judgments about sexuality matched the Rorschach results, and he concluded that certain therapists, psychiatrists, those who'd been in psychoanalysis themselves, those rated as good judges, were more likely to agree with the Rorschach findings.
Ah, so he's using stats to sort of prove that psychoanalytically minded clinicians were better at spotting homosexuality with the Rorschach.
Pretty much. It created this tentative link between the number-crunching quantitative side and the interpretive qualitative side, suggesting the homosexual signs, rooted in psychoanalytic ideas, were being confirmed by modern stats.
Right. A seemingly powerful combination.
But then Evelyn Hooker enters the picture.
Yes, and she throws a major wrench in the works.
Okay, so the Rorschach homosexual is being built up. Now, how does it start to get taken apart?
Well, the post-war era, it was complicated. Repression, yes, but also the beginnings of organized gay and lesbian communities, like the Mattachine Society. And they saw science as a potential ally to fight ignorance.
That was part of their strategy, yes. Seeking scientific validation.
And Evelyn Hooker was kind of uniquely suited for this.
She really was. Her background was in animal experimentation, not clinical psych, invested in the illness model of homosexuality.
Right.
Plus, she had gay friends, saw the discrimination they faced. She was also a bit of an outsider, academically gender her husband targeted in the Red Scare.
And her office mate was Klopfer, the Rorschach expert.
Bruno Klopfer, yeah. And he'd apparently encouraged her years earlier to study gay men who weren't patients.
So she gets funding in '53 from the NIMH. That's big.
Huge. To study non-patient homosexuals, comparing them to a heterosexual control group using the Rorschach, Petit-A, other tests.
Finding the heterosexual men was tricky, she said.
Yeah, apparently the stigma around a sex study made recruitment hard for that group, so she gets the test protocols.
And gives them to the experts, Klopfer and Mortimer Meyer.
Exactly. Blind, they don't know who is who. They have to interpret the Rorschachs, rate psychological adjustment, and guess the sexual orientation.
Okay, the big reveal. What did she find?
This is the bombshell. She found no significant difference in overall psychological adjustment between the gay and heterosexual groups.
And she screened the heterosexual group pretty carefully.
She did. Excluded guys who seemed disturbed or too bland or got really defensive, denying any homosexual experiences. Hegarty suggests this was partly about methodological rigor, but also a kind of performance of scientific objectivity.
Interesting. Ensuring the purity of the comparison group.
Right, and she only studied gay men, remember, not lesbians.
Why was that, did she say?
She later explained she worried people would question her sexuality if she studied lesbians, and that could discredit her work. She felt she needed this image of, her words, snow-like purity.
That's telling. That pressure.
It is. Hegarty links this idea of purity to Latour's concept, how science tries to create neat categories like straight-gay, even when reality's messier. Her own assumed heterosexuality became part of the scientific setup.
Okay, so how was her work received?
The homophile organizations, like the Mattachine Society in their review, and lesbian groups in the latter, they absolutely celebrated and publicized her findings. This was huge for them.
But the Rorschach researchers?
They mostly kind of ignored it or downplayed it. Many continued looking for homosexual signs, interpreting her study very narrowly so it didn't really threaten their basic assumptions.
Huh. And later activists, like Frank Kameny, had thoughts on this reliance on experts.
Oh, yeah. Kameny appreciated Hooker's work strategically, but he criticized the model where heterosexual experts spoke for gay people. He argued for epistemological self-determination.
Meaning gay people should define their own reality and knowledge.
Exactly. He pointed out the Mattachine Society mostly just supplied subjects for Hooker. He wanted gay men and lesbians to be the authorities on their own lives. Hooker herself later agreed Kameny was crucial for depathologization.
Okay, so Hooker challenged the clinical view. But then psychology itself starts shifting in the late 50s, 60s. More focus on statistics, questioning clinical judgment generally.
Right. There was this growing skepticism about the reliability and validity of many clinical tools and judgments, including the Rorschach. It wasn't just about homosexuality anymore.
And this leads to a different kind of critique. Enter Loren and Jean Chapman.
Yes. They came at it from experimental psychology with this concept of illusory correlation.
Illusory correlation. What's that?
It's basically a cognitive bias. The idea is that we tend to see relationships between things that seem like they should go together conceptually, even if they don't in reality.
Like seeing patterns that aren't actually there because they fit our expectations.
Exactly. And the Chapmans thought this explained why clinicians kept seeing homosexual signs in the Rorschach, not because the signs were real, but because they fit preconceived notions about homosexuality. It was a mental trick.
So they're not just saying the signs are invalid, like Hooker did. They're trying to explain why clinicians believed in them. They're psychologizing the clinicians.
Pretty much. Using cognitive bias theory to critique clinical practice and frame the clinician's judgments as potentially flawed thinking.
Did they re-examine the older studies, like Wheeler's?
They did. They reviewed several Rorschach studies on homosexuality and concluded only 2 of Wheeler's original 20 signs had any actual statistical validity.
Only 2. Which ones?
Things like seeing a contorted human or animal on card 7, or a human or humanized animal on card V. Most of the signs clinicians actually used.
Right.
Things like anal content, feminine content, genitalia, sexual confusion. The Chapmans deemed these invalid associative signs. No real link.
And they tested this idea further.
Oh, yeah. First, they surveyed clinicians, found they were using the invalid signs way more than the supposedly valid ones.
Okay.
Then they surveyed undergrads, found the invalid signs were more strongly linked with the idea of homosexuality in their minds.
So the conceptual link was there, even if the real one wasn't.
Exactly. Then came the clever experiments. They created fake patient Rorschach cards.
Fake cards.
Yeah. Pairing random Rorschach signs with patient problems, including sexual feelings toward other men. Crucially, they controlled the pairings so there was no actual correlation between the commonly used invalid signs and the homosexuality problem description.
And what happened?
Even with no real correlation in the data they saw, the student participants still reported seeing a strong connection between those invalid signs and homosexuality.
Wow. So they basically demonstrated the illusory correlation effect in action, believing they saw a link that just wasn't there.
Precisely. And Hegarty argues this work did a couple of things. It reinforced the view of experimental psychologists as more objective than clinicians,
Right.
and it kind of abstracted diagnosis away from real people into the lab, where categories like sexual identity could just be manipulated on index cards.
Was their work controversial?
Oh, definitely. People questioned their stimuli, tried to replicate or undo the effect. The illusory correlation idea got applied to other tests, too.
And it became big in social psychology, right, for stereotypes.
Huge. But, as Hegarty points out, its origins in critiquing the Rorschach diagnosis of homosexuality often get lost.
A closeted disciplinary narrative, he calls it.
Exactly. Students learn about illusory correlation and maybe racial bias, but not necessarily about how it first targeted heterosexist bias in psychological testing, which obscures the history and the shakiness of objectivity claims in psychology.
This whole story really makes you think about objectivity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Hegarty asks about using the Rorschach on the psychologists.
It does. It shows objectivity is this thing that's constantly being negotiated through these sometimes unstable alliances between different approaches.
And a key part of maintaining that objective stance seemed to involve psychologists not fully looking at their own position or the position of the people they studied.
Hegarty really emphasizes that. Think about the examples. Rorschach not revealing his own movement preference. Wartime researchers claiming expertise while signaling ignorance of gay lives.
Wheelers using stats to validate psychoanalytic hunches.
Hooker needing that purity. Studying only men, carefully managing her controls. The Chapmans moving diagnosis into abstract lab tasks.
It's like psychology sometimes struggled to be reflexive, to examine its own standpoint.
Hegarty suggests maybe it's tied to that old mind-body split, less rigorous self-examination in sciences of the psyche compared to natural sciences, making psychological objectivity seem, well, particularly fragile.
And this ties back to how societal views, specifically about homosexuality, drove so much of this Rorschach history.
Absolutely. Hegarty links Latour's idea of purification, separating things into neat categories, to Sedgwick's idea of the ongoing crisis in defining homoheterosexuality. The Rorschach kept getting aimed at that crisis.
And the psychologists doing the aiming often signaled their own heterosexuality, implicitly or explicitly.
Through various ways, yeah. Expressing homophobic views, claiming ignorance about gay life, erasing links to gay groups in research papers, doing research without gay participants, even co-publishing with spouses. Lots of subtle signals.
It's a sobering look at how science isn't conducted in a vacuum.
For sure. And while psychology today is generally much more affirming of LGBTQ plus identities, Hegarty's closing thought is important.
Which is?
That we still need to critically examine how heteronormativity might subtly shape what counts as objective science now. Doing that honestly, he suggests, might create a new kind of intellectual kinship with Hooker's own later reflections on how facts and ideas of good and bad are always being remade.
So, wrapping this up, it's quite a journey. An inkblot test, seriously used for decades to truly detect male homosexuality.
Built on, well, shaky ground, lots of researcher bias reflecting the anxieties of the time.
Until Evelyn Hooker's work delivered that major empirical challenge.
Right. Followed by the cognitive critique, the illusory correlation idea, explaining why the flawed practice might have persisted.
It's way more than just a story about a faulty test, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's a window into how scientific understanding, especially around identity, evolves or doesn't, and how deeply it's tied to social and cultural forces.
At least you wonder, doesn't it? How might our current ways of understanding identity, the methods we use today, look 50 years from now?
Exactly. What biases might we be overlooking? What does objective truly mean when studying something as complex as human experience?
It's a crucial question. And this deep dive really just gives a glimpse. Peter Hegarty's paper is there for anyone who wants to go deeper.
Highly recommended. Or other historical work on the psychology of sexual orientation. It's a rich, sometimes uncomfortable, but vital history.
And maybe the final thought is echoing Hooker again. What seems like settled science today could shift dramatically.
It's a reminder to stay curious, stay critical, and appreciate the ongoing evolution of knowledge and our understanding of human diversity.